Today is August 27th, 2021. This is Mordecai, host at The Updates, bringing you your daily Elden Ring update. There is too much news about Elden Ring today. It's funny because just 24 hours ago, I said it might be a while before we get some news, but little did we know that a couple of outlets, such as IGN, GameSpot, and Vati, all got to see a 16-minute Elden Ring gameplay demonstration this week, but in private. They also got to interview Yasuhiro Kitao, who is the head of marketing at From Software. The embargo for this lifted this morning, and we got to hear everyone's recounts of what they saw. I was unfortunately not a part of this, as I don't have high enough insight yet, but I've spent all of today reading all the articles and watching all the impression videos, and I've collected everything new that we've learned about Elden Ring today. Since we didn't get the gameplay video, you can just listen to my voice in the background and picture what the game looks like while you're watching this. Currently in the background, you're looking at the 6 new screenshots we received today. So sit back, relax, grab an Estus, cause we're gonna talk some Elden Ring. Oh, and spoiler warning just in case. So the footage that was presented was apparently very polished, it did not have a HUD, and it ran at a solid 60 FPS. Firstly, I want to talk about the world of Elden Ring. So, the first thing is that Elden Ring has been confirmed to have a map. The map is updated by finding map fragments throughout the world, so you can't see the entire map all at once at the very start. The map is beautifully illustrated and colored in a sort of classic RPG map design. The cool thing is that the map updates in real time, so you can see yourself on it. You can also drop markers on the map, and the marker shows up as a beacon in the world, so you can just follow it without constantly opening it back up. Also, if you push your right stick down while you have the map open, it switches to showing subterranean labyrinths, though it's not clear what those are exactly quite yet. There is also a compass point on top of the screen, similar to the one in Skyrim, showing which direction the player is looking at. According to the map's legend, you can mark many things on it, like weapons, bosses, enemies, gems, chests, banner, trees, castles, and etc. So the area you're looking at in this picture is supposed to be the hub of Elden Ring. You can access it by getting far enough in the story, and there will be more and more NPCs joining there as you progress. An interesting part of Elden Ring's world is the Legacy Dungeon. Legacy dungeons are similar to specific levels in their previous games. They're full of traps, enemies, and a boss, while they contain equipment, skills, and other rewards for you. These dungeons are separate from the overworld, and they're not procedurally generated like Chalice dungeons, but they're all meticulously designed levels. Legacy dungeons are also where we see illusory walls make a return in Elden Ring. You can do these legacy dungeons alone, or with friends and summons if you would like. The first Legacy dungeon, which is shown in the gameplay demo, is called Stormveil Castle. It's a huge, imposing structure that can be glimpsed from far away as you make your way towards it. In the gameplay demo, the player approaches the front gate. There's a checkpoint on your right, a closed iron gate in the front, and a small doorway to the left. The player ducks in through the door, where they are immediately greeted by a creepy figure in bloodied white robes, with bleached and withered pale skin and what looks like a book strung around their neck. This NPC advises the player against going through the main gate, and then they suggest instead that you should try the opening in the wall on the far side of this room because the guards don't know about it. By going that way, they say, we'll breach the castle undetected. The player is then offered an on-screen choice of go via the back way or go via the main gate. Both are viable ways to approach this Legacy dungeon depending on your level of skill and confidence. At the end of this Legacy dungeon, of course, is a main boss. You will approach a green fog gate, and after you enter the fog gate, there are cobble steps that lead downwards. And lo and behold, it is Godric the Golden. So, side note here, if you missed yesterday's video, I suggest watching it, but basically, there was a GIF on Bandai Namco's Giphy page, and it was tagged as Godric the Golden, which featured a GIF of this boss right here from the gameplay trailer. And we were all unsure if this was his actual name or not, and then hours later after this discovery was publicized, Bandai Namco went and removed those tags. So now we learned that it is his actual name, so it's nice to get that confirmation and see that the community sleuths were once again correct. But anyway, Godric is a demigod, one of the 6 in the game, and he's a king of all that is golden. The people who saw the gameplay demo described this boss fight as similar to Slave Knight Gale from Dark Souls 3, as the boss is very aggressive and agile. Supposedly, the gameplay demo ends with this boss fight. And that about wraps it up for the world of Elden Ring, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the gameplay now. So one of the biggest new things added to Elden Ring is a dedicated jump button. It makes traversal in dungeons particularly fun and useful. Like, one of the things you can do with it is jump shoot enemies with bows, which honestly sounds pretty overpowered. Lots of familiar weapons from Dark Souls 3 make a return in Elden Ring, but there's also more new weapons added, as Elden Ring is supposed to have the most weapons out of any previous From Software title. Speaking of weapons making a return though, apparently Dark Souls 2's twin blades are back, as you can see in the screenshot. In terms of armor, it is also very familiar to their previous games. You will have the ever so familiar setup of helms, chests, gauntlets, and leggings. Magic will also of course be in Elden Ring, and you will be using familiar items like catalysts and staves to cast them. Some familiar spells from Dark Souls 3 and some new ones are there as well. Pyromancy is there, and the ones that were shown in the gameplay trailer were a fireball and an improved firestorm. There will be familiar sorceries in Elden Ring like soul darts and also a giant version of the magic greatsword, and there will also be some new ones like a rain cloud that precipitates soul arrows and does a lot of damage. These of course will be using focus points just like the previous games. Additionally, ragdoll physics will be coming back in Elden Ring, so fear not. An interesting combat mechanic in Elden Ring is stances. It's not like Sekiro where there's a gauge, but it's more similar to posture and like a hidden meter that fills up with constant attacks. The enemies will be vulnerable and get staggered, similar to visceral attacks in Bloodborne where you can capitalize and do a lot of damage. There is also a new mechanic called Guard Counter, in which players can strike immediately after a normal block, but even these can be countered by bigger enemies. A crucial part of Elden Ring's combat will also be stealth. You can use stealth to backstab enemies, and it's very similar to Sekiro in that regard. If you don't feel like taking on multiple enemies at once, or want to sneak past them instead, you can use stealth and crouching in grass or behind ruins to make your way through. There's also a cool part of the demonstration where the player character scouts out enemies from afar with binoculars. Yes, that's right, binoculars will be in Elden Ring, and they will be a lot more useful than in previous games from the looks of it. Equip load in Elden Ring works like how it does in Dark Souls 3. The higher your equip load percentage, the harder it will be to roll. You can improve your equip load by increasing your strength stat. The death mechanic in Elden Ring works similar to how it does in Souls games as well. When you die, your experience points or your souls will become a bloodstain and you will have to retrieve them. Speaking of souls and experience points though, your currency in this game seems to be called runes. Which makes sense considering Elden Ring's code title was Great Rune way back in the day. Though leveling yourself up won't be the only way you can improve yourself in combat, as there are 100 skills which are similar to weapon arts in Elden Ring. You can equip these skills on certain weapons, but not every skill can be equipped on any weapon. You can gain these skills by killing bosses and certain enemies, or finding them throughout the world. Though skills and leveling up are only part of what makes Elden Ring's combat so accessible. In Elden Ring, there's also the ability to summon spirits in order to help you out. Spirit summons, like the one pictured, can be equipped by defeating specific enemies and slotting their ashes in your inventory. I believe these items are called Ashes of the Deceased. Each spirit also has its own upgrade path, and you upgrade them at the checkpoints while you're resting. Using spirit summons in battle consumes focus points, which I guess is to prevent it from becoming overpowered. People said they didn't see an Ashen Estus Flask item where you can restore your FP, but I'm sure there's an equivalent in Elden Ring somewhere. Spirit summons can only be summoned in single player, and not when you have an online summon or invader in your world. Which is kind of disappointing because I wanted to see how they would look like in PvP, but I guess it's understandable why you can't use them. So, you may be wondering, what kind of enemies are there in Elden Ring? Bosses, mini-bosses, regular mobs? Well, there is a new thing called field bosses which can be found in the open world. They are mini-bosses varying in difficulty that can be fought freely in the open world. The first one you'll fight in Elden Ring is a wyvern, the same one in the previous trailer, which was breathing fire on you while you were trying to roll away. Supposedly, this wyvern enters the arena by crushing a bunch of hollows beneath it, and then the boss battle starts. The second field boss you'll be fighting is this character right here. Yep, that's the character that was introduced in the concept art from 2 years ago. Defeating the second field boss unlocks checkpoints in the game. The checkpoints in Elden Ring are called Site of Lost Grace. Not only can you rest here, but you can customize your spirit summons and skills here as well. The Estus equivalent in Elden Ring will also be replenished once you rest at one of these points. Though since there are only a few grace points in Elden Ring, you will also be able to replenish your Estus by just killing enemies in the open world. After a certain amount, you will gain one back. This is a way From Software wants to motivate you to stay exploring instead of going back and resting. Some grace points in Elden Ring will shine a light to lead a way towards a recommended path, but it will be up to you if you want to go that way or take another path. Speaking of checkpoints though, From wanted to alleviate the frustration of walking back to where you died to collect your souls or fight another boss again, particularly in an open world with long distances. So what they did was add retry points in extremely difficult areas, so you can choose to respawn at the retry point instead of a distant bonfire or grace. I believe this makes sense as to why there are only a few grace points in Elden Ring, because with these retry points, you can have more frequent checkpoints where you can respawn when you die. Another cool part of traversal in Elden Ring is that you can fast travel to a checkpoint from anywhere on the map, except for when you're inside a dungeon. It seems like they really want to make traversal in an open world game be relatively seamless and easy, so you don't have to constantly go on long distance rides. While we're on the topic of rides, let's talk about our mount. The mount is called the Spirit Steed. It has a very seamless and video gamey feel to it, which prevents the player from feeling frustrated as if they're controlling a boat or something. You can summon your steed at any time and anywhere except for when you're inside dungeons or playing online co-op or PvP. You can jump or double jump with the steed, and even go on these little boost pads which send you on top of cliffs. The steed does not take your equip load into account, so you will go at the same speed regardless of your equip load. From Software compared the steed to the horse in Witcher 3 and Red Dead Redemption 2 in terms of companionship. In Elden Ring, you will be able to bond with your horse by doing things such as feeding it, which replenishes its health. From the mounted combat people saw, you can use bows, magic, throwables, and other items while you're on horseback to fight enemies. From Software suggested that it may be easier to use the horse to take on larger enemies and dismount if you want to take out multiple smaller enemies. Some other new gameplay elements include crafting. Crafting exists in Elden Ring, and you can harvest plants and animals in the landscape to make things out of them. Some animals that you can hunt include sheep, deer, eagles, and beetles. You can use their meat and bones to make dried meat, which works similar to how Green Blossoms did in previous Souls games. You can of course buy things from vendors as well, but crafting seems to be the cheaper option. You can craft weapons as well, such as arrows, and one of the cooler arrows introduced in Elden Ring is sleep arrows. Apparently they were prominent in the gameplay demonstration, where the player character used sleep arrows on small and even big enemies, and it put them to sleep for some easy kills. Crafting isn't as simple as it seems though, because in order to craft something in Elden Ring, you need to find the crafting recipe for that item in treasures or by defeating certain enemies. Another element of Elden Ring is that sprinting does not cost stamina when you're out of combat, but as soon as you return to combat, you will have to consume stamina once more. And finally, gestures will be in Elden Ring as well. The familiar ones that were shown in the demonstration were hooray, joy, applause, and deep respect from Bloodborne. As for lore in Elden Ring, Kitao said that lore will not be as hard to grasp and understood as previous titles. Of course, if you want to get a better idea of the game, you can read the item descriptions and different lore aspects of it, but you will also be able to experience firsthand the multi-protagonist drama that is presented in Elden Ring. It seems like Elden Ring is more about its characters than the state of the world and linking the flame like in previous games. The stuff George R.R. Martin wrote for Elden Ring happened many years before the events of the game that we will play in. Miyazaki expanded on that mythos and wrote the events that take place during when we play it. All item descriptions, character names, etc. are written by Miyazaki, and George gave him the freedom to take over in that department. It appears Godric the Golden was not the only name we were introduced to, as we have now been introduced to the Firekeeper / Maiden of Elden Ring as well. Her name is Melina. She is the NPC you need to visit in order to level up in Elden Ring. In the demonstration video, she's very plainly dressed in dark robes. She approaches the player and kneels while removing her hood, which reveals a distinct feature about her face. She has one yellow eye, but her other eye is shut closed over a blackened scar or a tattoo. She greets you at the beginning of the game by saying, "Greetings, traveler from beyond the fog. I am Melina. I offer you an accord." According to Kitao, she is not as reserved as the previous Firekeepers in the Soul series. Melina has got her own ambitions and her own big place in the story, so she doesn't have your best interest at heart. Another character's lore was inquired by the journalists, and it's of course, the Pot Boys. Asking what they're about, Kitao responded with, "The Pot Boys. We hope that players can explore and find their own answers in regards to the Pot People. You're free to befriend them if you wish, but we can't promise that you won't have to smash them." So, as we saw in this screenshot, they're sitting by one of the checkpoints, so I wonder if these are the ones we befriended, and the ones we see in the gameplay trailer are ones we will smash for loot. Kitao also mentioned Elden Ring has no direct ties to previous Souls games. That doesn't mean we won't see a callback or an homage here or two, but it's nice to get confirmation that it's not related to the previous games, unlike what George said. Elden Ring will also have multiple endings, and each ending is determined by your choices and interactions with different characters in the game. That's pretty much it in terms of lore, and now, our last topic is the multiplayer aspect of Elden Ring. PvP and co-op has already been confirmed, but they were more specific about it this time. You can only invade players in Elden Ring who have an online summon in their world and they are not mounted. So, players can't be invaded if they're riding their horse or if they're alone without any summons. This decision, From Software said, is not yet finalized, and I'm personally hoping they don't stick with it because I really enjoy 1v1 fights. As I'm sure you've noticed the PvP clips I've had in the background these last few months, most of them are 1v1 fights where I got to ambush the other player because they didn't know where I was in their world. But invading people who have 1 or 2 summons in their world already is just not the same. I also really enjoy being invaded, so to hear that I can't get invaded unless I have a friend in my world is a bit disappointing. I know this decision isn't finalized, so I hope they make it so there's a middle ground between it. A suggestion would be you can only get invaded in your world if it's nighttime as a solo player. Regardless, we'll have to wait and see for now. But as I mentioned, your horse is only available in single player and not during online or co-op. There's also a maximum of 3 players in co-op, so you can only summon 2 friends to help you along your journey. You can place your sign down in dungeons, legacy dungeons, or overland areas. This is also old information that was corroborated again today, but password summoning will be there of course. And there is also an asynchronous element for online, where you can set a password for your group so you can only see you and your friends' bloodstains, phantoms, and messages on the ground. Rest assured, there will be a password for our community once the game comes out so we can see each other's messages and deaths on the ground. That about wraps up everything we learned in terms of multiplayer, lore, gameplay, and the world of Elden Ring. As always, all the sources are in the description if you want to check them out yourself. If you want to see a detailed recount of the 60 minutes of gameplay, I suggest reading the Eurogamer article, since that one was the most detailed. Otherwise, I believe I've covered pretty much all the new details. Again, I wish we got to see the gameplay for ourselves so we didn't have to rely on other people's descriptions of what they saw, but it is what it is. The good news is that according to the people I talked to who got to see it, the 16-minute demo will be publicly released soon, so we will have that to look forward to for now. Anyway, this has been your longest Elden Ring update for August 27th, 2021.
The game is called the Elden Ring, and it's a sequel to a video game that came out a few years ago called Dark Souls, and